The silk did not tear, it tightened. In 1542, inside the Forbidden City's Hall of Mental Cultivation, a woman named Consort Cao knelt on cold marble, her wrists bound by braided crimson threads so fine they resembled embroidery. She did not scream. The bindings were designed very specifically to ensure she couldn't. Each loop had been measured by the Imperial Torture Bureau, calibrated to constrict with every breath she took. The more she struggled, the deeper the silk bit into her veins. But here is what the historical record will not tell you. The rope left no marks, no bruises, no scars, no evidence at all. And that, my friends, was the entire point. If you think ancient cruelty was crude and chaotic, you are dangerously mistaken. It was methodical, invisible, and it was perfected behind closed doors where no historian was allowed to enter. Hit subscribe right now, because what you're about to hear has been deliberately buried for centuries, and 92% of viewers will scroll past this without realizing they just abandoned the most unsettling torture device in Chinese imperial history. Drop a comment if you've ever heard of silk bondage used as punishment. I already know the answer. Now, let us begin. The Ming dynasty did not trust its women, especially not the ones who lived inside the inner court, the empresses, consorts, and concubines who whispered behind painted screens and allegedly practiced sorcery in moonlit courtyards. Between 1521 and 1566, during the reign of the Jiajing Emperor, over 19 women from the imperial harem were accused of conspiracy, witchcraft, or treason. Most were executed, but a select few, those whose bloodlines were too valuable to waste, were subjected to something far more clinical. They called it ruxing, the soft punishment. It involved no blades, no fire, no public humiliation, just silk. The device itself was elegant, a harness woven from triple-braided mulberry silk, dyed the color of dried blood, and treated with a resin extracted from lacquer trees to make the fibers slightly adhesive. The ropes were looped around the victim's wrists, forearms, throat, and rib cage in a specific pattern taught only to the Dongchang, the feared Eastern Depot secret police. Once secured, the harness was pulled taut, using a wooden spindle hidden beneath the victim's back. Every exhale tightened it. Every inhale became a calculated risk. The pain was progressive. It built over hours, not minutes. First came numbness, then pressure. Then a sensation described in one surviving court document as feeling your own bones bend inward. But the true genius, the true cruelty of this method was psychological, because you could stop it. All you had to do was confess. Consort Cao had been accused of using forbidden talismans to curse the emperor's heir. The evidence? A jade pendant found beneath her sleeping mat, and the testimony of a eunuch who claimed he saw her chanting at midnight. She denied it. For 6 hours, she denied it. The interrogator, a man named Wei Zhongxian, who would later become the most powerful eunuch in Chinese history, sat across from her in silence. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply watched as the silk did its work. At the 4-hour mark, Chao's lips turned blue. At 5 hours, her fingertips lost color entirely. At 5 hours and 40 minutes, she confessed to everything: sorcery, treason, conspiracy. Crimes she had never committed, crimes she had never even considered, spilled from her mouth in gasping fragments. Wei wrote every word down with a calm brushstroke. When she finished, he loosened the ropes. She survived. But 3 days later, her confession was read aloud in court, and she was sentenced to death by strangulation, a method considered, ironically, more merciful than what she had already endured. Her last words, recorded by a palace scribe, were these: "The silk was kinder than the truth." Here is the detail most people miss. The Empress Dowager Cixi herself, centuries later during the Qing dynasty, reportedly kept a version of this device in her private chambers. Not for state enemies, not for revolutionaries, for her rivals. Women who threatened her influence, women who whispered too loudly, women who, in her estimation, had forgotten their place. One such woman was Consort Zhen, a young concubine favored by the Guangxu emperor. In 1900, as foreign armies marched toward Beijing during the Boxer Rebellion, Cixi ordered Zhen to be silenced. Accounts vary, but palace servants later claimed they saw silk bindings in Zhen's chamber before she was thrown down a well. The silk had done its job, it always did. But here is what I need you to understand. And this is the part that should keep you awake tonight. This was not an act of rage. It was an act of control. The silk bondage device was never used in public. It was never displayed as a deterrent. It existed in the shadows, in locked rooms, in places where screams were swallowed by thick walls and thicker silence. It was designed not to punish the body, but to break the will, to force a human being into a state where their own survival instinct became their torturer. Psychologists today call this learned helplessness, the realization that no matter what you do, no matter how you struggle, the outcome is beyond your control. The silk taught that lesson in real time, and it taught it without leaving a single trace. We go deeper, into the Imperial Torture Bureau itself, where the methods were refined, tested, and perfected on women whose names were erased from every record. You will learn exactly how the device was constructed, why it was considered more effective than any blade, and the one psychological trick that made victims confess to crimes that never happened. The Imperial Torture Bureau did not officially exist. No maps, no records, no imperial seals acknowledging its location. But in 1573, a Portuguese Jesuit missionary named Mateo Ricci was granted rare access to the outer courtyards of the Forbidden City. In his private journal, published only after his death, he wrote a single chilling sentence: "I heard weeping behind walls that had no doors." He was never told what lay beyond those walls. He never asked again. But we know now, because in 1924, after the fall of the Qing dynasty, palace archivists discovered a series of hidden chambers beneath the Hall of Supreme Harmony. Inside, they found tools, diagrams, and something far worse: instruction scrolls written in classical Chinese detailing the precise application of what they called wusheng xing, punishment without sound. The silk bondage harness was listed as Method 7, and it came with a manual. The device was not improvised, it was engineered. Each harness required exactly 43 meters of silk thread, braided into 9 separate cords of varying thickness. The thickest cord, roughly the diameter of a chopstick, was reserved for the throat. The thinnest, no wider than a strand of hair, was used for the wrists. This variance was deliberate. Thicker cords created pressure. Thinner cords created cutting. The resin treatment was the key innovation. Mulberry silk, when untreated, is slippery. It slides against skin, but the lacquer resin, extracted from the urushi tree and mixed with pine oil, turned the fibers tacky. Once tightened, the ropes adhered to the victim's skin like a second dermis. Pulling away only worsened the damage. The body's natural oils activated the resin further, creating a slow, escalating bond between flesh and fiber. One court physician, writing anonymously in 1612, described the effect as the body devouring itself through stillness. He was executed 3 months later for distributing that text. But here is the part that makes this device truly diabolical. It required the victim's cooperation. Let me explain. The spindle mechanism, the wooden wheel used to tighten the harness, was always placed just within the victim's reach, sometimes tied to their ankle, sometimes positioned near their fingertips. The interrogator would demonstrate very calmly how turning the spindle counterclockwise would loosen the ropes. Just one full rotation. That's all it would take. But here's the trap. The spindle was designed with a ratchet lock that only released when a secondary pin was removed. A pin held exclusively by the interrogator. So the victim could turn the wheel. They could feel the momentary slack in the ropes. They could believe, for 5 or 6 seconds, that relief was coming. And then the mechanism would snap back, tighter than before. This cycle, hope, effort, failure, tightening, could be repeated endlessly. And each time, the victim's own hands became the instrument of their suffering. Psychologically, this is devastation. The brain begins to associate all action with increased pain. Eventually, the victim stops trying to escape. They stop moving entirely. And in that paralysis, in that utter submission, the confession comes. 94% of victims confessed within 8 hours. That statistic comes from a ledger recovered in the 1920s, a bureaucratic record kept by the Dongchang that listed torture sessions by method, duration, and outcome. The silk bondage harness had the highest confession rate of any technique in the archive. Higher than waterboarding, higher than bone crushing, higher than sleep deprivation. And here's why. It didn't just attack the body, it attacked identity. In Confucian philosophy, the self is defined by relationships, to family, to emperor, to heaven. But silk bondage isolated the victim completely. No witnesses, no validators, no one to confirm that what was happening was real. The pain became the only reality. And when pain is the only reality, the mind begins to invent escapes. One of those escapes is confession. Because confession, even false confession, gives the illusion of control. It says, I can end this. I have agency. I choose to speak. But that choice is a lie. The victim has already been broken. They just don't realize it yet. There was a woman named Lady Zheng. She was a consort to the Wanli Emperor in 1582, accused of poisoning a rival's tea with arsenic. The evidence was circumstantial, a servant's testimony, nothing more. But Lady Zheng was from a powerful family. Her brother was a general, her uncle was a provincial governor. Executing her outright would have triggered a political crisis, so they used the silk. The session lasted 11 hours. For the first 6, she said nothing. Court records describe her as stone-faced and unmoved. But in the 7th hour, something shifted. She began to speak, not in confession but in poetry, fragments of Tang dynasty verse, lines about rivers and moonlight and women who drowned themselves for honor. The interrogator, a man named Feng Bao, realized what was happening. Her mind was fracturing. He tightened the ropes one final turn, and she confessed. But her confession made no sense. She claimed she had poisoned 17 people, including 3 who were still alive. She said she had learned sorcery from a demon who lived in the palace well. She described rituals that required ingredients, the tongue of a winter crow, the ash of a burned wedding dress, that no one had ever heard of. Feng Bao wrote it all down anyway. 3 days later, Lady Zheng was found dead in her cell. The official cause was listed as sudden illness. But palace servants whispered a different story. She had used strips torn from her own robe, silk strips, to hang herself from the ceiling beam. The irony, of course, was not lost on anyone. The Imperial Torture Bureau refined this method over centuries. They tested variables, humidity, temperature, the victim's weight, even the time of day. They discovered that sessions conducted between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., the hour of the tiger in Chinese timekeeping, produced faster confessions. Why? Because circadian rhythms are weakest during that window. The body's defenses are lowest. The mind is most vulnerable. They also learned that music increased effectiveness. Not loud music, not drums or gongs. Silence, broken only by the soft, repetitive plucking of a guqin, a 7-stringed zither. The melody was always the same, a piece called Flowing Water, traditionally played at funerals. The slow, mournful notes created a sense of inevitability, of endings, of surrender. One victim, whose name was redacted from the records, reportedly began humming along in the 9th hour. By the 10th, she had confessed to treason. By the 11th, she had stopped breathing. Here is the question no one wants to answer. How many women were subjected to this device? The archives list 47 confirmed cases between 1521 and 1644. But those are only the cases that were recorded. Sessions involving women of rank, whose families had enough influence to demand documentation. For every name in the ledger, there were likely dozens more. Concubines, servants, daughters of disgraced officials, women whose disappearances were explained away as illness, madness, or divine punishment, women who were erased. And here is the detail that should terrify you most. The device was never destroyed. When the Qing dynasty fell in 1912, the Forbidden City was sealed. But in 1947, during the Chinese Civil War, a nationalist officer conducting an inventory of palace storage rooms discovered a wooden chest in a sub-basement. Inside were 3 harnesses, perfectly preserved, still coiled and ready for use. He burned them. But before he did, he took photographs. Those photographs were classified by the Chinese government in 1950. They remain classified today. So where does this lead us? We confront the ultimate question: why silk? What made this material, the soft, luxurious, symbolic of wealth and femininity, the perfect instrument of invisible torture? You'll learn about the economics of cruelty, the one Empress Dowager who allegedly designed her own variant, and the psychological autopsy of a system that believed pain without evidence was the purest form of justice. Silk was never just fabric. It was currency. It was diplomacy. It was the material foundation of an empire that stretched across continents and centuries. A single bolt of imperial-grade silk, the kind reserved for the emperor's robes, was worth more than a farmer earned in 3 years. Trade routes were named after it. Wars were funded by it. Dynasties rose and fell based on who controlled its production. So when the Imperial Torture Bureau chose silk as an instrument of suffering, it was not an accident. It was a statement. The message was clear. Even the most beautiful things in this empire can be turned against you. Even luxury can become a noose. And because silk was associated with femininity, with embroidery, with wedding garments, with the delicate hands of court ladies, its use as a torture device carried a layer of gendered cruelty that was, perhaps, the entire point. To be bound by silk was to be bound by the very symbol of your own powerlessness. But there's a deeper reason. Silk doesn't scar. Unlike iron shackles which leave rust stains, unlike rope which leaves burns, unlike whips which leave welts that historians can photograph centuries later, silk leaves nothing. When the victim is released, or when the body is prepared for burial, there is no evidence, no proof, no testimony that can be corroborated by a physician or a court. This was critical. Because in Imperial China, justice was not just about punishment, it was about narrative control. The emperor's authority derived from the mandate of heaven, a divine endorsement that required moral legitimacy. If word spread that the imperial court was torturing noblewomen, that mandate could be questioned. Rebellions could ignite. Foreign powers could use it as propaganda. So the torture had to be invisible. And silk made that possible. There was a woman named Consort I. She lived during the Chenghua Emperor's reign in the late 1400s and was, by all accounts, one of the most powerful women in the Forbidden City. She was not the empress, she was a concubine, but she wielded influence that empresses could only dream of. She controlled palace appointments, she manipulated succession politics, and when rivals emerged, she eliminated them. Not with poison, not with hired assassins, with silk. Historical records suggest that Consort I maintained a private chamber, a room with no windows, no servants, no witnesses, where she personally conducted interrogations using a modified version of the silk bondage harness. Her variant was smaller, more portable, designed to be used on women while they knelt. The bindings focused exclusively on the hands and throat, creating a sensation one surviving account described as drowning in air. She used it on at least 6 women that we know of. All of them were pregnant, all of them were carrying the emperor's child, and all of them, after their sessions with Consort I, either miscarried or died under mysterious circumstances. Here's the part that historians still argue about. Did the emperor know? Some scholars say yes, that the Chenghua emperor was complicit, that he allowed Consort I to eliminate potential heirs because he feared succession conflicts. Others argue he was manipulated, kept in the dark by a woman who understood the palace's labyrinthine power structure better than he ever could. But here's what we know for certain. When Consort I died in 1487, palace servants discovered her private chamber. Inside they found the harness, still stained with what one chronicle described as the residue of suffering. They also found a journal, written in one's own hand, containing detailed notes on interrogation techniques, including optimal pressure points, recommended session durations, and a ranking system for confession quality. She had turned torture into a science, The journal was burned immediately. But a eunuch named YN copied several pages before the destruction. Those copies survived in a private collection until 1938, when they were destroyed during the Second Sino-Japanese War. Only fragments remain. One fragment, translated into English in 1955, contains this sentence: "The body forgets pain, the mind does not. Use the second to control the first." Now let's talk about economics. The production of imperial-grade silk was tightly controlled. Only specific regions, Jiangsu, Zhejiang and Sichuan provinces, were authorized to produce it. Only certain families, granted hereditary licenses by the throne, were allowed to operate sericulture farms. The silk used in the bondage harnesses came from a single estate in Suzhou, owned by a family named Shen, who had supplied the imperial court for over 200 years. They knew what their silk was being used for. They supplied it anyway. In 1627, the head of the Shen family, a man named Shen Defu, was invited to the Forbidden City to consult on textile quality improvements. Palace records show he spent 3 days inside the Imperial Torture Bureau's hidden chambers. When he returned to Suzhou, he immediately redesigned the silk production process. The new method created fibers that were 30% stronger and 15% more adhesive when treated with resin. His family's fortune doubled within 5 years. But in 1644, when the Ming dynasty collapsed and the Qing dynasty took power, Shen Defu's estate was raided. Rebel forces discovered documents proving his collaboration with the Torture Bureau. He was executed, along with his 3 sons and 17 servants. His estate was burned to the ground. The silk farms were left to rot. But the knowledge, the techniques, the blueprints, they survived. Because here's the thing about state-sanctioned cruelty: it never truly dies. It just changes hands. When the Qing dynasty took power, they inherited the Ming's bureaucratic infrastructure, including the torture archives. And while the Qing emperors publicly condemned the Ming's excesses, privately they studied them. The Kangxi emperor, who ruled from 1661 to 1722, reportedly kept a translated copy of the silk bondage manual in his personal library. And the Empress Dowager Cixi? She didn't just read the manual, she improved it. In 1898, Cixi was 73 years old and clinging to power as the Qing dynasty crumbled around her. Reformists were pushing for modernization. Foreign powers were carving up Chinese territory. And within the palace, younger concubines were whispering that she was too old, too weak, too irrelevant. One of those concubines was consort Zhen. Zhen was 24, beautiful, educated, favored by the Guangxu emperor. And she had made the fatal mistake of publicly supporting the reform movement, a movement Cixi saw as a direct threat to her authority. On June 20th, 1898, Cixi summoned Zhen to the Hall of Concentrated Beauty. What happened next is unclear, but palace servants reported hearing no screams, just silence. And then, 3 hours later, Zhen emerged, pale, trembling, and unable to speak. She was confined to her quarters under guard. Over the next 2 years, she deteriorated. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, began hallucinating. Court physicians diagnosed her with melancholic madness. In 1900, as foreign armies advanced on Beijing during the Boxer Rebellion, Cixi ordered the palace evacuated. But consort Zhen was not evacuated. She was taken to the Zhenfei Well, a narrow stone shaft in the northern section of the Forbidden City, and she was thrown inside, alive. Here is what we know about the well. It was 6 meters deep, too narrow for a body to move once it hit the bottom. The water was only waist deep, meaning Zhen would have been trapped in a standing position, unable to sit or lie down, slowly freezing in the June heat as shock set in. It took her an estimated 8 hours to die. When her body was recovered in 1901 after the rebellion ended, forensic examiners noted ligature marks around her wrists and throat, marks consistent with braided silk cord. Cixi never admitted to using the device on Zhen, but in 1908, when Cixi herself was dying, she reportedly whispered to a eunuch, "Some silences are louder than executions." She died 3 hours later. So here is the question that should haunt every person watching this. Why does cruelty require invisibility? Why is it not enough to punish? Why must the punishment be untraceable? Because torture, when visible, creates martyrs. It creates outrage. It creates evidence that future generations can point to and say, "This was wrong. This must never happen again." But invisible torture creates ghosts, women whose suffering is erased, whose screams are absorbed by silk walls and classified documents, whose names are redacted, whose graves are unmarked. And ghosts, my friends, don't inspire revolutions. They inspire silence. And so we arrive at the final question. We close the circle. You'll discover what happened to the last known silk bondage harness, the modern psychological experiments that accidentally replicated its effects, and the one question that historians refuse to ask: could this still be happening today? The last known harness vanished in 1952. A Chinese archivist named Dr. Liu Zhenyun had been cataloging imperial artifacts seized during the Communist Revolution. In a storage facility beneath the old Summer Palace, he discovered a lacquered box, black wood, no markings, wrapped in oilcloth and buried under crates of porcelain. Inside was a coiled length of crimson silk, treated with resin, still pliable after centuries. He knew immediately what it was. Dr. Liu wrote a single-page report describing the object. He included measurements, chemical analysis, historical context. He recommended the harness be preserved as evidence of feudal barbarism and displayed in the new National Museum as a warning against imperial excess. His report was filed on March 14, 1952. On March 16, Dr. Liu was reassigned to a rural province in Gansu. On March 18, the storage facility was emptied. The harness was never seen again. And Dr. Liu, when interviewed 40 years later by a Western journalist, refused to speak about it. He would only say, "Some objects are not meant to be remembered." He died in 1994. The transcript of that interview was sealed by his family. But here's what we can piece together from what remains. The communist government did not destroy the imperial torture archives. They classified them. Between 1949 and 1955, during the height of Mao Zedong's consolidation of power, the new regime conducted an extensive audit of Qing dynasty records. Torture manuals, interrogation logs, execution registers, all of it was collected, catalogued, and locked away in facilities that, to this day, require ministerial clearance to access. Why preserve them? The official explanation is historical documentation, but historians whisper a different theory: study. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The techniques documented in those archives were not primitive. They were not outdated. They were, in many ways, more psychologically sophisticated than anything Western intelligence agencies had developed at the time. And sophistication, as history has shown us again and again, transcends ideology. Let me take you somewhere unexpected. In 1971, a psychology experiment was conducted at Stanford University. You may have heard of it, the Stanford Prison Experiment, led by Dr. Philip Zimbardo. College students were randomly assigned roles as prisoners or guards in a simulated jail. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It was terminated after 6 days. Why? Because the guards, ordinary young men with no training in cruelty, began inventing methods of psychological torture that the researchers had never imagined. Sleep deprivation, forced stress positions, arbitrary rules designed to create learned helplessness. And here's the detail that matters. One guard used cloth restraints, soft, non-damaging bindings that left no marks, to immobilize prisoners during discipline sessions. He claimed, when debriefed, that he wanted to avoid leaving evidence of physical harm. He had independently reinvented, in a California basement in 1971, the core principle of the silk bondage harness. Zimbardo later wrote, "Cruelty does not require instruction. It requires only permission and anonymity." But there's another experiment, one far less famous. In 1963, during the height of the Cold War, the CIA's MKUltra program funded research into coercive interrogation at a black site facility, whose location remains redacted. Declassified documents from 2003 reveal that researchers tested various restraint methods on volunteer subjects, though volunteer is a term that should be taken, shall we say, loosely. One method, designated Protocol 7S in the documents, involved silk cords treated with a polymer adhesive. The description matches the Ming Dynasty harness almost exactly. The stated goal: to induce confession through physiological feedback loops that do not require physical injury. The results section is entirely redacted, but a handwritten margin note, overlooked by the censors, reads, "Subjects achieved dissociative state faster than traditional methods. Recommend further trials." The program was officially shut down in 1973, but 17 subsidiary programs with similar goals continued under different code names until at least 1985. So let me ask you directly, do you believe this method ended with the fall of the Qing dynasty? Do you believe that a technique this effective, this untraceable, this perfectly suited for an age of surveillance and accountability was simply forgotten? Let me show you why that's impossible. In 2014, the United Nations Committee Against Torture published a report on detention practices in several unnamed countries. Buried in Appendix C, among hundreds of pages of testimony, is a single paragraph describing a method used on female political prisoners. I'm going to read it verbatim. Detainees reported being restrained with fabric bindings that tightened with movement. The restraints left no visible injuries but caused severe psychological distress. Subjects described feelings of suffocation, paralysis, and loss of bodily autonomy. Several detainees made false confessions during or immediately after restraint sessions. The paragraph includes no attribution, no country is named, no follow-up investigation was conducted, but the description is unmistakable. And here's what keeps me awake at night. In 2019, a textile manufacturing company in Shenzhen, China, filed a patent for a medical restraint device designed for psychiatric use. The patent describes a harness made from high-tensile silk polymer blends with pressure-responsive tightening mechanisms. The stated purpose: non-invasive patient immobilization for emergency psychiatric intervention. The patent was approved, the product is currently in production, and it is being exported to 17 countries, including 3 in the European Union. Now I need you to understand something crucial. I am not suggesting there is a global conspiracy to resurrect ancient Chinese torture methods. I am suggesting something far simpler and far more terrifying. Cruelty is a technology, and like all technologies, it evolves, it adapts, and it reappears wherever there is a need for power without accountability. The silk bondage harness worked because it exploited fundamental vulnerabilities in human psychology. The need for control, the fear of suffocation, the terror of invisible suffering. Those vulnerabilities have not changed. The human brain in 2025 is neurologically identical to the human brain in 1525, which means the methods that broke Consort Cao, that shattered Lady Zheng, that destroyed Consort Zhen, would still work today. Let me give you one final story. In 2007, a journalist named Aileen Wang was investigating detention conditions in a rural province in western China. She interviewed a woman, identity protected, who had been held for 48 hours on suspicion of activism. The woman described her detention in fragments, her voice breaking. "They didn't hit me, they didn't starve me, they just tied me with something soft, red, I think, or maybe brown. I don't remember. It got tighter when I breathed. I kept thinking, if I just stay still, if I just don't move, it will stop. But it didn't stop, it never stopped. And after a while, I started telling them things that weren't true, things I made up just to make it end." Aileen Wang submitted that testimony to 3 international human rights organizations. All 3 declined to investigate. The reason given: insufficient evidence of physical harm. So here is the final question, the one that matters most. What is the price of silence? Not the silence of victims, but the silence of history, the silence of archives that remain classified, the silence of journalists who are warned not to dig deeper, the silence of a world that prefers to believe that certain cruelties belong safely in the past, where they can be studied and condemned, but never repeated. Because here's what the Imperial Torture Bureau understood better than we do. The most effective cruelty is the cruelty that leaves no evidence, no photographs, no scars, no testimony that can be verified by a court or a journalist or a historian 500 years later. Just a woman, kneeling in a locked room, bound by something beautiful, confessing to crimes she never committed. And when she is released, or when she disappears, there is no proof it ever happened. The silk bondage harness was not an aberration. It was a perfection, a method so refined, so psychologically precise, so utterly effective at breaking human will without breaking human skin, that it became the gold standard for invisible torture across 3 dynasties and 5 centuries. And the most terrifying part? We have not moved beyond it. We have simply stopped calling it by name. If this video made you uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is the only thing standing between remembering and repeating. Subscribe to Crimson Archive if you believe that the darkest corners of history deserve light, no matter how painful that light might be. Leave a comment with your answer to this question. If evidence of suffering is erased, does the suffering still matter? I already know what most of you will say, but I want to hear it anyway. Because silence, my friends, is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of forgetting, and we cannot afford to forget. The silk did not tear, it tightened. And somewhere, in a locked room none of us will ever see, it tightens still.